This is a previously recorded Best of the Ohio Ram show.
I'm going to get on with our very special guest that I'm glad to have with us tonight. A name that is known well in the Ram circles and in racing circles, and that's Lon Haldeman up there in Wisconsin. How are you this evening, Lon?
Good, good. I'm glad to be with you.
Well, I'm sure glad you took time to be with us, and this was kind of spur of the moment this evening, and we just found we had a time and we'd get you on here. Now, for those of you who, could there be anybody watching this show who doesn't know who Lon Haldeman is? We better tell him. Lon, just give us a real quick rundown. You were in the very first Ram, which was at that time called the Great American Bicycle Race, 1982. And tell me a little about that and some of your other events and records.
Well, like you say, the first race across America was actually called the Great American Bike Race. It was had 4 riders, all by invitation, because there were no really qualifications at that time except for trying to get the most well-known endurance athletes together. And John Marino had set transcontinental records in 1978 and 79 and 80 and was a transcontinental record holder. John Howard had won the Ironman triathlon, so he was a household name. Michael Shermer had set a record from Seattle to San Diego, and then in 1981 I set a double transcontinental record from New York to Los Angeles back to New York, and on my return trip I broke John Marino's transcontinental record. So I was basically invited to participate in the race because I had broken John's Marino's record. So that's why the 4 of us were invited basically to be in that first race. So cycling really wasn't like it is today, where you got every weekend there's 200-mile events and brevets and all kinds of stuff. Back then it was you had to really look to find a 200-mile race somewhere, the Davis Double Century or something like that. So anyway, I was invited to participate in the first Great American Bike Race, and ironically, just a few weeks ago I did a program for the McHenry County, Illinois cyclists, and we actually looked at that first Great American Bike Race Wide World of Sports program, which was a 90-minute show, and we watched it in its entirety, and it really brought back a lot of memories for us about how difficult that race was for me, but then also how much of a following it had across the country. I mean, this is on Wide World of Sports on I believe it was a February Sunday afternoon, and that's when there was only 3 or 4 television stations at the time, so it had a tremendous following across the country. And so there's a lot of people that started watching that race on television who really didn't know anything about cycling, and that race really put cycling on the map as far as public identity. And so that's was my first race, besides the double transcontinental in '81. And then over the next 10 years I went on to do 14 more races across the country. Some of those were tandem record attempts with my wife Susan and Pete Pensears, who's won Ram a few times, and then of course participating in Ram. So there were some years I was doing 2 races a year across the country. So it was a real busy 10-year stretch for me.
Yeah, and you mentioned your wife Susan. I would love to have her here, but tell me a little bit about how you two got hooked up together, and B, a little bit about her own record.
Well, Susan and I probably almost met in passing in 1980 during a bicycle ride race across Missouri and back, a 540-mile event. And I was the first man finisher, and Susan was the first woman finisher, although she was basically the last person to finish. I think there was 17 finishers out of about 35 starters that year. And so I had contacted Susan, the old-fashioned way by writing a letter, and we basically corresponded. She then came on my crew the next year for the double transcontinental, and she got interested in trying to set a woman's transcontinental record. So in 1982, before the Great American Bike Race, which was in August 4th, I think hers started like on around June 10th. She took off from Los Angeles and set a woman's transcontinental record of 11 days, 16 hours. And kind of a story about that ride, which not everybody knows, is back in those days, it was considered abnormal to ride at night. So she'd ride during the day, and then at maybe 9 o'clock at night, sundown, whatever, go to bed, sleep till the next morning, sunrise, get up and ride another 250 miles, and then go to bed again. Well, that's what she did across the country, but even at that pace, she was almost beating my transcontinental record that I had set the year before of 10 days, 23 hours. Well, she ran into a few problems and stuff with some weather and things, but towards the end of the race, from probably around Athens, Ohio on, she decided just to ride nonstop to New York City, which I think is around 600 miles. Yeah. And she rode that last 600 miles totally nonstop in around 36 to 38 hours, I believe. And by watching her do that, I knew that it was possible to go that long without taking a sleep break every 250 miles. So 6 weeks later, during the Great American Bike Race, all of the four of us guys are getting ready to race, and Wide World of Sports is saying, okay, you guys are going to ride, across California 250 miles, take a sleep break, then you're going to ride, get up the next morning, ride another 250 miles, take a sleep break. So they had this schedule all planned out for the filming. And so what I did is, and just by chance, I said, well, if Susan could ride 600 miles nonstop at the end of a transcontinental, I should be able to do that at the start. And so I took off that first day, across the desert, rode through the first night, rode into the second day, tried to take a sleep break in Prescott, Arizona, around 400 miles, but it was more like just off the bike, changing clothes, didn't really get any sleep. And then I continued to ride until about Joseph City, Arizona, which is around 600 miles, before I really took my first sleep break into that second night. And the only reason I really stopped is because there was a rainstorm blowing in and it turned into headwinds and stuff. And so I went to sleep probably from about 2 in the morning until about 5 in the morning. Well, it turned out that totally changed the race, because by the time I woke up, the other riders had stopped for the night and I had close to a 6 or 7 hour lead. And ABC Wide World of Sports was like, oh, well, this is very unique. Why did somebody ride through the night? And it turned out that that was the first time that had really been done in a transcontinental record attempt, and of course the race. So that kind of set a new precedent, I guess, of how people approach the race. And nowadays in Race Across America, that's common. That's everybody expects to do that. Riding the first day and a half or the first night anyway before taking a sleep break. But anyway, that's just something about Susan's record attempt. And Susan went on then the next year, 1983. We were married in June of 83, and 10 days later we took off on a tandem transcontinental record, and we went from Santa Monica to New York City in 10 days, 20 hours, which at that time set the all-time tandem record across the country. And at that time, there really wasn't, well, there was kind of the start of a women's division in Raam, although it was still in its infancy. So Susan didn't race in the Race Across America that year, but I did. But Susan then continued. I think she raced in the next 7. She did 7 transcontinental records. And her fastest time was 1989. She did 9 days, 9 hours. Which I think it still stands for the fastest northern transcontinental record, where riders actually have to go through hilly Ohio and on into New York City. So anyway, she's had a very productive cycling career also, doing a transcontinental record almost every year during the 1980s.
Well, I had the privilege of seeing Susan, and actually, my wife and I followed her just a little bit on our tandem when she came through Ohio at '89. That was such a delight, and as you may or may not know, by default, the show has sort of taken on the agenda of trying to encourage women, ultracycling, endurance racing. So that was where I saw something that always fascinated me. The men, Lon, looked awful. They looked awful. But when Susan came through, she was smiling and engaged and having just the greatest time ever. I thought, there's something different about the women. They brought something new to it. So that was such a delight. I was at the time station here in Inglewood, which is just a couple miles from me. But I think the very next year, if I recall, they moved the route south for a number of years.
Yeah, went to Savannah pretty much all through the 1990s.
I was going to ask you if the story I'd heard about Susan coming up with the idea of riding all night long and you picking up on that idea were true or not, but you've already confirmed that for me.
Well, yes, and I'm not sure if it's that much of an intentional idea Susan had. It's just that that's the way it worked out. I mean, you know, at the end of the race, she got into this attitude that, you know, she wasn't feeling that good. Of course, she's basically exhausted, and she decided she's just going to, you know, to keep on racing all night long. So that's what she did over the, you know, the last 600 miles. Which had I not seen her do that, I would have thought, well, maybe that really wasn't a good idea for me to try that at the beginning of the race. Well, the women's record theoretically had been set about a month earlier by a woman from Austin named Ann Kovich, and I think she did it in around 14 days. And when Susan and I were both kicking this idea around way back the previous year, we were like, oh yeah, you can do a 15-day transcontinental record. That'll be 200 miles a day. That's pretty good. Well, one thing led to another. Ann Kovich, you know, sets a record, and then Susan starts on her record attempt and was on pace for my 10-day 23-hour record, because we pretty much knew where I was every night, and she was within hours of being exactly where I was. And then it wasn't until somewhere around the Mississippi River she lost some time, but so it was, she wasn't sure if she's going to break, you know, 10 days 23 hours or not, but then she picked up the pace again at the end, and I believe her time from Athens, Ohio in was probably faster than what I had done the previous year. So she did set really the, you know, she had a record to break, to beat in the 14-day range, but she was well ahead of that pace, and I guess the carrot in front of her was the men's transcontinental record that I had set the previous year, so that's what she was kind of pacing herself to do.
I found this picture that I took of you and your daughter Rebecca in 2006. I think you were officiating that year, weren't you, Lon?
Yes. Yep. Yeah. And Rebecca was on the journalist crew, so she was writing articles for the website at that time.
That was at when the time station at Troy, Ohio, when the route went north of Dayton. It's since been moved to the alignment we have now, going through Oxford and Blanchester, between Dayton and Cincinnati, and there's where I'd been involved with the time stations before, but it came back to Ohio, and this was only about 12 miles from where I live. That was the perfect location, Lon. They gave us rooms in the hotel, we had food, we had everything you could want right there within a stone's throw of us. That was a great spot. Do you have any reflections on endurance racing, ultracycling, where it's going, the race across America, anything about it that you've been thinking about you'd like to share with us?
Well, I mean, the good thing is the race has been around for, going on 33 years or so now, at least.
34, I think, coming
34 coming up, yeah, this year. And so that's a really good track record, because I know in those first years, we didn't even know if it was going to happen the next year. As a rider, you know, we were trying to get sponsorships and, you know, train and stuff, and we didn't know if there was going to be a race the following year, usually until like February or March. So, on one hand, you're trying to get sponsors, which you needed to do the previous October, November. But on the other hand, you're like getting in this training, and then you don't even know the race is going to happen because Wide World of Sports didn't want to commit to a contract until it was on television, which usually didn't happen until the following spring. So from that standpoint, it was difficult being a racer. And nowadays, crews are planning 2 years in advance for doing the race and whatever. But back in the day, we didn't even know if things were going to happen, and so that was always a little tough. Trying to get the sponsorship lined up and your training, because you don't want to go out and be training 1,000 miles a week if you don't even know there's going to be a race, or when the race dates would be. ABC was determining a lot of that, and they were bouncing those race dates around based on other film schedules and other events and other things like that. So that was always a little more difficult. And I guess the other thing about those early years that I've appreciated more as things went on is the pioneering experimentation that we were doing then, not just with trying to ride all night, sleep and whatever, but the diet, the equipment, the evolution of things that have happened over the years, and a lot of that was happening during those early years. As far as we were making our own aero bars out of pieces of PVC pipe and bolting things onto the handlebars, trying to say, well, I wonder if this, using aero bars, I wonder if that would help. Pete Penseers, was playing around in his basement with a lot of that kind of stuff. Even with the diets, we were drinking Carnation instant breakfast liquid diets, trying to come up with diets that would work. And even shoes and trying to get, clipless pedals. There was those first, oh boy, I don't know how many years. It wasn't until like 1987 that I even had clipless pedals to use. So, a lot of those things today that are, taken for granted, we were really experimenting around to see if how well they would work. And so that's why, you look at some of those times of those races back then and go, oh, gee, why were those guys so slow and whatever. But, a lot of it was experimentation. And some of those, like the 1982 race in particular, I look back on that. That's still the most brutal race I was ever in. I was so hammered at the end of that. I was exhausted halfway through, and plus you didn't know where anybody was in the race, so I raced the whole thing thinking I didn't know if a 6-hour lead was good or a 10-hour lead was good. I had no idea. Where nowadays, everybody gets a little upset with the Raam website if they don't have instant feedback every 10 minutes. But back then we barely had. We didn't have really any good information because we didn't even have time stations. So you didn't even know exactly when people went through, except for an official who was driving from the front of the pack to the back of the pack, back to the front of the pack. And as the spread got larger and larger between first and last, we barely saw an official once a day with a race report. And by that time, most of the information was 18 hours old. So if you said, boy, you had a 200-mile lead, it's like, boy, is it really 200 miles or is it 150 or is it 250? So, we'd go down for a sleep break, in the early morning hours, and we'd have to post a guard, in a car 50 miles back just to make sure that if anybody got within 50 miles, then I'd wake up and start riding again. And so from that standpoint, things were always stressful. So, and the other thing about the Raam route book, if people are using the Raam route book today, they got GPS, the route book, I don't know how many pages it is. It's probably, it's got to be 100 pages long. Many details, every mini-mart, every traffic light, every street turn and everything. Back in the first Raam route book was 3 typed pages long, and it basically said, like, get on Interstate 10, go across, and it had the towns listed. There might be, go through Flagstaff, Albuquerque, get off at Tucumcari, New Mexico at the 1,000-mile mark, get on Route 54, go to Wichita at 1,400 miles, stay on all the way until you get to central Missouri at 1,900 miles, then you get off and take another turn. So, you basically had a magic marker highlighter pen traced on a AAA map, and that was the route. So when you went into Terre Haute, Indiana, with all those turns, or you went cross town, we went through Indianapolis and we went through other places like that, you didn't know what you were doing. You said, oh, we're supposed to follow Route 40 or Route 36 or whatever it was, and we would have the crew going up ahead, maybe 10 miles ahead, trying to mark corners, but you didn't have cell phones, so the crew couldn't report back where the turn actually was. So you only had CBs, which only worked for line of sight in a city. So we were winging it all the time on trying to find routes and things across town. And of course, when things, when it got foggy and you couldn't see well and various other things. So it was like, boy, I hope I'm on the right route. I haven't seen a road sign here for 10 miles. And you're like, well, the magic marker on the map says we're supposed to be going towards this town, so let's just hope that this road goes to that town. So also from that standpoint, those early races were always stressful. But at the time, you didn't really know it, that things were as crude as they were. But I'm just comparing that to nowadays. And even when we were race directors in the early 2000s, GPS was just becoming available on the market. But we went out and actually painted the Raam route. We had arrows on the road all across the country. So I had riders tell me, oh, the crew put the route book away, weren't even looking at it because they were just following the arrows. Well, nowadays, with the GPS, I believe a lot of crews are watching their laptop with their GPS connection, and the GPS is talking to them, oh, you've got to turn in 200 feet or 500 feet or 5 miles, whatever. That would have been great to have back in 1981, because we did a lot of advanced exploring just to find out the routes. And that's one of the reasons why Susan and I would go out by bicycle and car and basically ride every route the month before we did the race, because we just needed to scout it. And in hindsight, that gave us a lot of confidence, because I knew the route more or less by the back of my hand, and I would be able to tell the crew, we're going through Terre Haute, this is where the turn is, it's by the Shell gas, it's up ahead, whatever. But so I knew the route a lot better than the crew did, and it was mainly the crew driving the motor home, and the extra vehicles are the ones that got lost because they were trying to wing it, just following the route book or the map or something through town. So anyway, looking back on it, I guess the equipment, the diet, and the mapping and the communication are probably the biggest things that have changed so much in the race over the last 20 years, from what those races were during the first 10 years. Yeah, and actually that 1982 is available on YouTube, in a 10-part series. Somebody uploaded it, which was really interesting. For your Ohio volunteers that are helping out with those time stations, I mean, that's a great thing that they're doing, to be able to come out there for 2 days or a week or how much time they're at the at the time station. That really helps out the race a lot, and I know the riders really appreciate it, even back in the days when we had the very time stations. As a rider, counting down how far is it to the next time station, just because you wanted to have that interaction of somebody cheering for you as you went by in the middle of the night. So I say that's a great thing that you've organized, and that the people of Ohio are supporting Raam the way that they do. It really helps out the race, and the riders really appreciate it.
We do appreciate you being on the show, and we wish you and Susan all the best. Please say hello to her. And we didn't say this, but Susan goes under the name of Susan Nortelangelo. Lon, thank you again for being with us.
Okay, great. Thanks for asking me.
Thank you for taking the time out. We certainly appreciate that. And with that, we're going to say goodbye for now, everyone.
This is Gregory Zuber, thanking you for watching and sharing.
Music by Kevin MacLeod.